Just a quick couple of notes. If you still do not have a seat, there is space in ASC 130 that's right across the hall. Or if you are so inclined, maybe you can steal some chairs from the hallway and set them up in the front here. But those are your options if you do not have a seat. Or you could stand. But I'm sure we're breaking some fire marshal regulations at this point. We won't tell anybody. Also, to defray some of the costs of this tonight, we do have a donations box. Please do not feel obligated to donate if you don't want to, but we are collecting donations there right out this door here. If you turn around, there's Kyle. I'll wave at Kyle, and he's carrying a nice donations box. We would really appreciate your donations to bring John MacKay all the way from Australia. So, I have one more note I have to make. There will be video recorded of this event. We have quite a few video cameras set up here. We will try to get them online as soon as possible. The information for where to find the video will be at uvcocreation.com. And there will be either the video there or the link to where to get it. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce Chris Walker, CBC radio host and journalist of Daybreak in Kelowna. Let's give him a hand.
Right smack dab in the middle here because I'm moderating. I don't want to give away my position. My name is Chris Walker. I'm the host of Daybreak on CBC Radio 1 here in Kelowna. We broadcast at 88.9 FM on weekday mornings from 6 to 9 a.m. And first, thanks to the Creation Club for inviting me to moderate the debate. I will do my best to keep these gentlemen on time and on point, as I will with all of you. We all know why we're here tonight, but I'll remind you just of the setup. This is a formal debate. So we have a 5-minute introduction from each gentleman. We have then a 20-minute main case argument, and then a 10-minute rebuttal. I will be relatively strict with time. I'll be giving a 1-minute warning or a 30-second warning, depending on what stage of the debate we're at. I will now, first of all, thank you all for coming. This should be lots of fun, and I'll introduce our two debaters this morning. I always say this morning because I'm on the radio in the morning. So, my apologies in advance as I say good morning to you through the night. John MacKay is the Australian Director of Creation Research. He has informally debated Richard Dawkins, who you may have heard of on YouTube, and the NCSE's Eugene Scott on the radio. John has formally debated the Centre for Inquiry's Christopher DiCarlo, John Polkinghorne, who is the UK's leading theistic evolutionist, among others. He's presented his research at geological conferences. He's lectured extensively in universities, schools, and churches throughout North America, really all over the world, Europe, the Caribbean, Australia, New Zealand, and Asia. He is a published author, as you can see. He has also appeared widely on radio and television. And each gentleman behind me has submitted a favorite quote for this evening. I will share John MacKay's with you. It's short. The truth shall set you free. It is inscribed in the sandstone mantle above the old entrance to the Science Department at Queensland University, as quoted from Jesus Christ. Round of applause for John MacKay. To my right, physically, if not socially, or possibly evolutionarily, Dr. Dan Ryder is a UBCO Assistant Professor of Philosophy, where he's taught since 2004. He has a background in both philosophy and biology. He has a Bachelor of Science in Cellular, Molecular, and Microbial Biology, a Master's of Arts in Philosophy and Neuroscience, and a PhD in Philosophy. His current research focuses on theoretical neuroscience and its implications for long-standing questions in the philosophy of mind. He's an active member of the Centre for Inquiry. He's also interested in the promotion of good thinking practices in the general public. Dan's quote is a touch longer. What is the aim of philosophy? To be clear-headed rather than confused, lucid rather than obscure, rational rather than otherwise, and to be neither more nor less sure of things than is justifiable by argument or evidence. That quote is from Jeffrey Warnock. just in case any of us forget, here's the topic for this evening. Be it resolved that the genetic and fossil evidence supports the evolution model and refutes the biblical creation model. So without further ado, we will start with our introduction. 5 minutes apiece. We'll start with Dan Ryder. Oh, one more thing before we go. Questions, comments, rotten tomatoes, canned goods cannot be thrown at the stage or lobbied at the stage until after this is all finished. We will have time for the audience to ask questions and I'm sure voice opinions. So that will be done at the end. Please hold your applause and your comments until then. So without further ado, an introduction by Dr. Dan Ryder.
All right, everybody hear me all right? Yeah? Okay. So first I want to thank the Campus Creation Club for inviting me to participate in this debate. Frankly, it's grown into something way beyond what I thought I was signing up for. But thank you anyway, I guess. I'm glad at least that you folks are willing to give the opposition a hearing. And thanks also to Mr. MacKay for coming so far, and to all of you for listening. All right, now, there are two kinds of debates. When professors like myself debate at a conference, everyone's arguments are on the table ahead of time, right? And the aim is to have a rational discussion where you're aiming at the truth, right? You're trying to get closer to the truth. And the other kind of debate, right, the debate club kind of debate, the truth doesn't really matter that much. What's important is to score points, right? To out-razzle-dazzle your opponent. Now, if you sort of go through some YouTube videos of debates with creationists, they love the razzle-dazzle kind of debate, okay? Here's why. The reason is that science, right, overwhelmingly favors evolution. And the reason it does overwhelmingly favor evolution is the sheer weight of evidence on the side of evolution. I mean, creationists have literally billions of pages of science journals arrayed against them, okay? But that's not a problem in a debate, right? Because the scientist that they're debating is going to barely manage to, scramble through a pamphlet. So all the creation has to do, right, is take that pamphlet, add a little doubt here, a little razzle-dazzle there, right? And whoops, the audience goes away thinking, gee, maybe that creationism stuff isn't as crazy as all those scientists say it is. Right? And that's why the U.S. National Center for Science Education says, don't debate creationists. They're just setting you up, okay? So why am I doing this? Good question. Okay, now that makes it sound like creationists are kind of underhanded and dishonest with their debate club tactics, right? But from the creationist point of view, these tactics are entirely justified, right? They think they're saving souls, right? And if that were really true, well, you can see why that would be very important, right? Mr. MacKay thinks that in my capacity here tonight, I am a tool of Satan, right? He says as much on his website. So, of course, he's going to do whatever it takes. That makes sense. Anyway, let me say at the outset, I totally concede the razzle-dazzle debate club debate, okay? This ain't no Clash of the Titans, let me tell you, okay? He's got loads of debating experience. This is my very first public debate. He's got the cool accent. He's got the field jacket. I don't even have a lab coat. I'm a philosopher. He's the showman, right? He makes a living doing this kind of razzle-dazzle. I'm a professor, which means, and some of my students here will attest to this, I make a living putting people to sleep. He's the master of sound bites. I've heard it. I'm about as comfortable with sound bites as I am with mosquito bites. And I can be scratching from that one for days. All right? That said, I did try to make this debate at least partly that first kind, the truth-seeking kind. I fear my success was limited. Mr. MacKay refused to provide me with his arguments in advance, for instance, and he wouldn't allow fact-checking helpers in the audience. But he did agree to continuing the debate online. Me and him, back and forth over 2 weeks, right, where we can delve into those billions of pages that I was talking about, okay? As far as I know, this is actually a first for a creationist. So if you're genuinely open-minded on either side, right, you must go to that online continuation, right? That's where the real debate is going to happen, not here tonight. And it starts in mid-February because we're both too busy until then, but please check it out. There's the URL. Write it down, please. Okay? That's where it's going to happen. All right. Young Earth creationists like Mr. MacKay believe that all the different kinds of plants, animals, and other organisms on Earth, including human beings,
That's time.
were separately created.
Time.
Okay,
5 minutes.
Look, yeah, sure. I'll start my 20 minutes with this one here. All right.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Dr. Ryder and John MacKay.
Well, if you can all understand my accent, let me try and soft pedal a little here. If you're going to debate a topic like that, you have to know something about creation. Not just creation in general, but biblical creation. God steps out of eternity, he exists before what he makes, he's not a part of what he makes, and he's smarter than what he makes. He declares he made everything very good. You weren't there, I wasn't there, but there's lots of checkable implications. The universe, life, ecosystem should show intelligent design that will not come from the stuff it's made of. In the same way, I made that PowerPoint, at least the typing on the bottom. It didn't happen by itself, and none of you believe it ever would. The next implication, naturalistic processes over time will never originate life, DNA, or new kinds. Reason for that comment? The evolutionary model says given long enough, that'll happen all by itself. Biblical creation, God not only made the world very good, he created things as separate in existence right from the start. Comparison, 10 times in Genesis, you read that God made things separately and after their own kind. Evolution doesn't accept that premise. Predictable evidence, fossil and biological evidence should show that creatures have been in recognisably separate groups right from the start, and they still are. But don't go away, it gets worse. You see, by chapter 3, it talks all about the big problem. We blew it. God cursed the ground, the world goes from good to bad, so the history of the world will be changed, but not evolution. Don't go away, it gets even worse still. You see, man's sin continues, Noah's flood, etc., and the implications, the original intelligent design will now be overlaid by degenerate change. The genes, climate, etc. Struggle will result, survival of the fittest, extinction, etc. It's got an implication about the age of things. The age of the earth will prove to have nothing to do with whether anything was created, for one simple reason. The evidence something was created turns out to be unrelated to whenever it was created. But, since degeneration is time dependent, the longer we've been here, the more degenerate we will become. In other words, change is true, but it will be the opposite of evolution. In fact, I like to chastise my evolutionist colleagues for their hypocrisy. They believe that atoms like uranium have been decomposing into lead long enough so that non-coded hydrogen could turn into coded DNA. Or to say it another way, big atoms like uranium have been falling apart into smaller atoms long enough for weeny teeny non-coded atoms or molecules to evolve into humongously big information-rich molecules. It should be obvious both of those processes can't occur at the same time. Oh, and one last thing. I could give the evolutionist 10 zillion times longer than he wants. But the mere fact that we have electromagnetic radiation, which they are using to argue our vastly old Earth has been pouring onto Earth for vast amounts of time and it destroys DNA, They argue that that gives you enough time for hydrogen to turn into DNA. Won't happen votes, but degeneration is and will. Implications? New diseases will occur by degeneration of genomes in the environment. Things such as symbiotes will become parasites. Interspecies chemical signaling, which most of you don't have a clue about, I find it fascinating, but it's collapsing. Oh, and of course there are just a couple of other things that are really profound and moral in their implications. The big picture out of biblical creation, and not just creation, is that death is not a necessary biological event. It's a moral penalty. But I'm going to leave it there, and we'll come back to all of those implications in the body of my debate. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You have 40 seconds to add anything.
Oh.
We'll now present the main case. Professor Ryder will start. I'm going to make myself more comfortable just over here. You have 20 minutes.
Wait, can I buy those extra 40 seconds off?
I think it'll cost you
$50. All right, so young Earth creationists like Mr. MacKay believe that all the different kinds of plants, animals, and other organisms on Earth, including human beings, were separately created less than 10,000 years ago. By contrast, I think that all life on Earth is part of a vast family tree stretching over several billion years, ultimately leading back to a common ancestor. Okay, so the crucial differences are these: separate origin in a short time, or common descent over a long time. Okay, that's what this debate is about. It's not about the existence of God. Okay? For today, I believe in God. It's not about the origin of the universe. For today, at least, I believe that God created the universe. It's not about the origin of life either, right? For today, I am granting that God created the first life. So that point about hydrogen to DNA, irrelevant. The question is, what was the first life like? Was it horses and hippopotami? And then what happened afterwards? Okay, so where does the evidence point? Separate origin in a short time, or common descent over a long time? Well, here's something that both sides agree on. Virtually all biologists agree with me that the sum of the total evidence points overwhelmingly in favor of evolution. So in 1987, Newsweek estimated that a mere 0.1% of biologists and geologists were young Earth creationists. Even if it were, 10 times that number, which is probably more accurate today, it's a landslide. Normally, this would just settle the question, right? If you want to know the answer, you ask the experts. And who are the experts about life on Earth? Biologists, of course. And I wonder if you really realize what this expertise consists in, how truly astonishing is the volume of knowledge that's been accumulated in biology. So let me talk briefly about that. These biologists, they're the people who deciphered the fundamental blueprint for life, DNA, and then sequenced all 3 billion letters of the human genome and mined it for an enormous amount of information, a tiny amount of which is summarized in this graphic here. Every blip and line is a piece of biological knowledge, and that's just one genome of the many that have been sequenced. These are the people who understand in detail a vast amount about how these DNA blueprints build bodies, like yours, with its 200 trillion cells. Genes make proteins, and those proteins do all the jobs. Here's just one example on this slide. Biologists have figured out the complex structure of this protein and understand exactly how it does its job. And this job is a tiny role in a function that you've probably never heard of called osteoclastogenesis. And it goes wrong in a disease you've probably also never heard of, osteopetrosis, not osteoporosis. Osteopetrosis is the opposite. And this is merely one of thousands of similar examples. These are some of the, on this list, some of the identified genes, their proteins, and the precise jobs that those proteins do in the bacterium that causes pneumonia. And the complete list, of which this is a tiny portion, right, is merely one of thousands of such lists in organisms from tiny bacteria like this one to whales. This extremely simplified diagram portrays a tiny portion of the things those proteins are doing, right? The chemical reactions in the body that they help make happen. That's called metabolism. Biology has a truly phenomenal knowledge of metabolism in the natural world. Go to PubMed and start looking stuff up. This diagram shows the metabolism of one thing, tryptophan, in one organism, yeast. Biologists have figured out in equal detail the metabolism of thousands of things in thousands of organisms, including, remember, how the genes and the proteins make it happen. But we've just scratched the surface. Biologists understand the complexity of the immune system. This diagram represents one tiny collection of facts about how a group of, in this case, mouse genes react to the infectious disease, in this case, called scrapie. In my area of expertise, the brain, our knowledge is no less stunning. This diagram just shows some of the connections that exist in the monkey's brain. And biologists have identified and described around 2 million species, not counting bacteria. And if we're lucky, that's only about a fifth of what's out there. So I hope that gives you a bit of a feel for those billions of pages. And that's literally billions, okay? When I say millions of those pages are explicitly about evolution, right? At a very minimum, hundreds of millions of those pages are on subjects that biologists say only make sense in the light of evolution. Now, I'm not going to talk about those pages much today. We're going to talk about those online later. All right? But let me quote a couple of famous biologists, okay, on how evolution makes sense of all the rest of biology and how just, without it, biology's nothing. So, Dobzhansky. Without evolution, biology becomes a pile of sundry facts, some of them interesting or curious, but making no meaningful picture as a whole. So remember that image. This is Peter Medawar, Nobel Prize winner, immune biologist. For a biologist, the alternative to thinking in evolutionary terms is not to think at all. And I could spend the rest of the night piling on similar quotes, but given that my audience, I think, is largely coming from our local conservative Christian churches, you're more likely to believe a like-minded neighbor. So here's Dennis Venema, an evangelical Christian, a former young earth creationist, and there's a current biology professor at Canada's largest evangelical college, Trinity Western. He says, well, the evidence is everywhere. It's not just that a piece here and there fits evolution. It's the fact that virtually none of the evidence we have suggests anything else. An evangelical Christian. Okay? All right. Now, I don't have time, unfortunately, to get into this billion pages, okay? But we will talk about this online, where the real debate's going to happen. But I'll just briefly point to the evidence that convinced Dennis Venema. Look at these words. They all mean the same thing in different languages. Some of them are really similar, some of them are very different. Now, what do we infer from this? And if you look at the entire languages, there are massive patterns of similarity and difference. What do we infer from this? Well, we infer that, for example, Spanish, Italian, and French are very closely related. That doesn't mean just similar. That means they descend from a common ancestor. Okay? Linguists make use of these patterns of similarity and difference to trace the history of languages. This is just straightforward common sense. Okay? French, Spanish, and Italian are closely related, and English is more distantly related. Finnish, on the other hand, is in a completely different language family. And as we saw in that list, right, it's one of the outliers. There's not that much similar there. Right? Languages are actually more complicated than organisms because they can they can send information across family members a lot more easily than organisms. Here is a slide from an article in Science from September 2011 by Meredith et al. And it shows, well, a trace of common descent for a bunch of organisms. And how did they figure this out? Well, what they did is they looked at the DNA and they saw patterns of similarity. And guess what? Those patterns of similarity fit into exactly the sort of tree diagram that you get with languages. This was a comparison that Darwin saw. Okay? This is conclusive evidence that there's common descent. Chimp and human DNA are 98% similar out of 3 billion letters. You know, if a student came to me at the end of the course and handed in their paper, and it was 33 volumes long, and when I looked at it, it was almost exactly the same as the Encyclopedia Britannica. You know, I think I'd probably suspect plagiarism, wouldn't you? All right, this is what's going on here. That's the level of similarity we're talking about. That's the you know, to say that essay, oh, it's just a coincidence, sir. I didn't copy it. Completely unbelievable. Okay, that's the evidence that convinced Dennis Venema, and we'll talk about that in more detail, I'm sure. Okay, so there's these billions of pages. Hundreds of millions of them don't make any sense except in light of evolution. And yet John MacKay and a few others tell these biologists, look, you're wrong about where the evidence points. It doesn't point towards common descent over billions of years, right? In fact, it points in the opposite direction. Separate origins in the blink of an eye. That's like standing up on a podium at a chemistry convention and telling them, it's all rubbish, folks. There's no such thing as the atom. So the question that I'm going to focus on is a sort of higher level question. How can young Earth creationists believe that biology has got it so catastrophically wrong? And that's not to mention the geologists and the physicists, right? These are just a smattering of the basic claims that young Earth creationists disagree with science about. We're just looking at one tiny example, common descent, the one in red there. Again, how can young Earth creationists believe that science has made hundreds of these gargantuan mistakes, not to mention millions upon millions of smaller ones? Returning to just the biologists, right? Again, how can they think biology is so massively wrong about where the evidence points? Well, I'll tell you how. They think that science has ignored or suppressed one crucial piece of evidence. Or more specifically, Genesis. And for our purposes, a few sentences. For example, this one. Okay? And if it's not the Bible, then it's another religious text. So they think that biologists are so blinded by atheism or something, by denial of the Bible and the supernatural, that they desperately force the evidence to fit with their favorite hypothesis, that there was no creator. Of course, what I say, along with the vast majority of biologists, is this. It's the creationists who are making that mistake and desperately forcing the evidence to fit their favorite hypothesis, that Genesis is the truth, that it is inerrant, and not in a loose sense, no, a literal truth. I mean, you could say the earth brings forth here is just a metaphor for the evolutionary process, but young Earth creationists won't have any of that wishy-washiness. So here's the situation. Biologists say the evidence points massively towards common descent, and the young Earth creationists are being misled by adhering to Genesis. They're being misled about where the evidence points. Young Earth creationists, on the other hand, think the evidence does not point massively towards common descent, and it's the biologists who are being misled about where it points by their adherence to atheism. Now, we know someone's making a big mistake here about where the evidence points, right? The evidence can't both massively point towards common descent and not massively point towards common descent. Somebody's being misled. Who is it? Well, let's look. This is where my argument is. If the biology professors are the ones failing to see where the evidence really points because they're being driven by their atheistic worldview, right, then we should expect that the field is vastly dominated by atheists and agnostics. Right? The reason, supposedly, the biologists don't believe in separate origins is just that they don't believe in God, right? They're anti-God. If that's right, we should expect all those biologists who believe in evolution to be atheists, or at least agnostics, right? The vast majority, in other words. Well, how many biologists do believe in God? How many biologists are theists? What do you think? 0.5%? Remember, there was only, what, 1/10 or maybe 1% young Earth creationists? So there should be only around that who believe in God. No. A full 40% of biologists believe in the existence of God. This is data from Neil Gross at UBC Vancouver. Very recent. So, and this is in the US. So biologists are definitely not being driven to evolution by their atheism. Now, what about if I'm right? What if it's the creationists who are blind to the evidence, because they're the ones who are being driven solely by their belief in the literal truth of Genesis? Well, then we should expect that all those young Earth creationists who are biologists, not very many, we should expect all of them, though, to be literalists about Genesis, or inerrantists. And guess what? That's exactly what we find. All the indications are that the tiny handful of biologists who are young Earth creationists are fundamentalists or evangelicals or some other religious denomination that accepts the literal truth of Genesis. Neil Gross's data indicates this. Barbara Forrest's extensive research indicates this. And when the creationist community has been challenged to give names of even a handful of their number who aren't conservative Christians, they fail to do so. Here's another thing we should expect. If I'm the one who's right, and it's the biologists, right, who are seeing the evidence clearly, while the young Earth creationists are blinded by their adherence to this literal interpretation. Look, suppose I'm wrong. Suppose the evidence points towards separate origins for people and cows, dolphins, hippopotami, ferns, the cold virus, etc., etc. Right? If that's right, then there should be atheist or deist biologists who think that these organisms had separate origins, right, at the hands of an intelligent designer, just not God. Right? Imagine you're a biologist who's one of these hardcore, never going to change your mind atheists. We're supposing the evidence points towards separate origins, objectively. Okay? Here's what at least some of those atheists should do. She thinks, well, they clearly have separate origins. Look at the evidence, right? But it can't be God. I'm not giving up the atheism. I know there must be some alien intelligence out there who did it, or something like that, right? If the evidence really does point towards separate origins, or if the evidence is even uncertain, there should be many atheistic biologists who believe in separate origins. Believing in separate origins doesn't mean you have to believe in God. So how many atheist biologists believe in separate origins and intelligent design? You guessed it. 0. Okay, again, indicating it's not the evidence that pushes people to young Earth creationism. It's something else instead. And we saw what that is. It's a literal interpretation of Genesis. So here's where we are. Where does the evidence point and who's being misled? Well, if the biologists are right, then all young Earth creationists should be literalists or inerrantists about Genesis. Check. They are. Also, no atheist biologist should believe in separate origins. Check. That's right, too. On the other hand, if the young Earth creationists are right, the vast majority of biologists should be atheists. No big fat X on that one. So it looks like it's the young Earth creationists who are the ones being driven by a dogmatic belief that they can't let go of. Not the other way around. Now, I can hear some of you thinking, and I'm going to run out of time. I can hear some of you thinking, but, maybe all the scientific evidence points towards common descent. But the Bible isn't like one more bit of genetic evidence, right? Or one more bit of fossil evidence. It's the Bible. It's the Word of God. It couldn't be wrong. That's what inerrancy is. Mr. MacKay is very clear about this on his website, right? The Bible trumps everything. You believe the Bible no matter what. Well, what's wrong with this? Here's what's wrong. Finding out about the world is like doing a jigsaw puzzle. Except your kids have been messing around with the puzzles again, and you know that there are some pieces in the pile that don't belong. Okay? You're doing this one puzzle, life, the universe, and everything, right? And you've got too many pieces. You get all this information, right? You're trying to make it fit into a coherent overall picture. Dobzhansky. You've placed a lot of pieces that you're pretty sure belong in the picture, right? There's a table here. I'm pretty sure that goes in. I love my wife and kids. I know that goes in, right? I'm sure of that stuff. And we can go beyond that, way beyond that now, right? The continents have moved around on the Earth's mantle. There are atoms. The sun is 93 million miles away. As they fit better and better into the picture, they fit with more and more pieces, right? Become ever more confident that they belong there. But remember, your kids have been messing around, and you don't know. And you know there are some pieces there that don't belong. They might seem to belong for a while, but they don't.
1 minute.
When it becomes clear they don't fit, you toss them, at least tentatively. So we tossed the Earth is flat piece ages ago, right? Even though it seems to be implied by the Bible and by that. And we tossed the Earth goes around the sun piece. And we tossed a piece that said rotten meat transforms itself into maggots, right? And in the moral part of the puzzle, we tossed that slavery piece. Again, despite what the Bible says. But the thing is, you never know for sure that a piece belongs there. You never know when a piece might be revealed as one of the imposters that your kids dropped in, right? It seemed okay for a while, but it's just not fitting anymore. You got to toss it. I'll bet they were pretty sure for a very long time that a 500-ton piece of metal can't fly, but we got rid of that one. So what Mr. MacKay and other creationists are doing is this. They're picking up the piece that says, Genesis is literally true. And they're saying, no matter what happens, I'm putting this piece in my puzzle. I don't care. I don't care. Give me 1 more minute.
The 43 seconds that you were
I don't care how bad the fit is. It's going in. God damn it. Well, they're not going to say, God damn it. There is literally nothing that is going to make Mr. MacKay change his mind. Okay? So here he is. There's the huge puzzle. And that piece he's committed to doesn't fit.
Time.
The evidence points massively in another direction. Now, I'm not saying he can't make it fit. I've got like 3 sentences. Sure he can. All he needs is this. Right? Fly in the face of all the science and get out the X-Acto knife. Right? And when he begins speaking in a moment, that's what he's doing. Okay.
Provide you 20 minutes and 30 seconds.
I'd much rather have the $50 than the 30 seconds. No wonder he talked about pieces in a puzzle, because he didn't fit them in, did he? Right to the end. You want to discuss biblical creation? You want to discuss evidence? We need to talk about the logs. Nature, February 2002, had an interesting article on the world's first scientific classification. The earliest case of systematic naming occurred about 6,000 years ago, writes the author, when God brought all these newly fashioned creatures to Adam to see what he would call them. Interesting paper. In fact, if you ask who invented our modern system of classification, genus and species, the answer, of course, is Carl von Linné or Linnaeus. Give me another 10 seconds here, boss. That better, is it? Okay, and of course, Linnaeus was an evangelical Protestant Christian. And he knew what Genesis 1:11 said, because he could read just like you and I can, and God commanded the earth to bring forth plants after their own kind, and he firmly believed the God who was there had actually revealed that truth. But you're reading in English. And the English subdivision of groups there is kind, and Linnaeus is responsible for our classification system. But in those days, you read Latin and Greek at university. And if you look at the Vulgate, finished 405 AD, the word kind is the word genus. But you can go back to 200 BC, when the Egyptian copy of Genesis was written in Greek, and you find the same word there, genus. So the word genus doesn't come out of abstraction. It's borrowed from a creationist source, who, of course, the word itself comes from the ancient Greeks as well. So in English, kind, Greek and Latin, genus. It shouldn't surprise you then that Professor Stephen Gould, the late and demised one, who I'm sure believes in God now, actually wrote that. Our ability to classify both living and fossil species distinctly and using the same criteria fits splendidly with creationist tenets. Don't be surprised, we invented the scientific system and it works on living and fossil creatures. Funny thing, if it came from a creationist system and the fossils are helped for evolution, it shouldn't work on the fossils, but it really works quite well. The question is, but what evidence shows that this is how life does and has functioned? Let's give you some practical experience. Take you to Australia. You'll see Brisbane on the east coast. We'll go just north of there to one of our research sites by our lovely big pond. Well, at the moment it's absolutely drowned in water from our floods, but nevertheless, we began excavating there some 10 years ago. Big logs turned to stone, buried with big rocks, all directions. Great exercise. Big logs, smashed logs, anything but a fossil forest. No branches, no roots, they didn't grow there. There's the geologic map of the area. If you want to know, it's in the Myrtle Creek sandstone, you look it up later. And we've been excavating for years now, acres and acres of stuff. We've called it our Jurassic Ark site, and if you want a free PR job, come and visit us sometime. You can read all about it on creationresearch.net. But we call it Jurassic because all the fossils in it are like the rocks in the Jura Mountains, and I have to tell you this, but the concept of Jurassic was invented by a creationist. It had nothing to do with evolution, nothing to do with millions of years. Excavation, 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 mapping. Mapping was organised by our resident geologist. He's a professional geologist, Liam Frohmeyer. There's our first draft to show the distribution of some of the logs in one quadrant. And it's got big cobbles. The bigger the rock, the faster the water. Logs float, rocks don't. Cross bedding, abraded trees. They rubbed against one another. Every geologist who's been there says this is a dump. Stuff was washed in here and dumped. Well, here's one of your Canadian washed in here trees that weren't growing there. And, well, they'll probably wash away eventually, but these ones did. We've called it a fossil flood log jam. It's exactly what it looks like. We've set it up as Australia's only outdoor creation museum. We have tourists there, we have schools there. They enjoy coming along to see some of the rocks we found. The fossils, like this one, we sent it off to the forestry department to see if our estimation of what it was correct. And yes, they agreed fully. This is a southern conifer. Grew in a very good environment, nice broad tree ring, no evidence of harsh winters, etc. And Araucaria, if you don't know what a southern conifer is, they're magnificent. Southern because they're only found presently in the southern hemisphere. Some of the names you might be familiar with: bunya, hoop pine, kauri, or at least you're growing our famous latest one, the Wollemi pine, here in this university. Why do I mention it? Well, it hit the headlines big time a few years ago as a living fossil. Buy your own and grow it. There's the one I'm growing, a living Wollemi, thought to be extinct for over 100 million years. There's the branch beside a rock full of fossil Wollemis. We knew about this plant before we found a living one. Okay, now if you really thought that rock was over 100 million years old, and I used to, then I'm sorry, but all the evidence tells you for the last 100 million years or so, Wollemis have actually turned into Wollemis. No help to the theory of evolution at all. We set up what we call a living fossil forest. There it is a few years ago. We planted all sorts of things, bunya pines, living fossil cycads. We've even dug up some of the logs and stood them back upright so that the students can compare the fossil one right alongside the living one. And we've reached the same conclusion as Charles Darwin. This is one portion of his work that I totally agree with. He invented the term living fossil for the simple reason, how do you describe living creatures that look for all purposes like the ones you find in the rocks? What else would you see there? Well, I found this fossil tree fern in a block of limestone in the Jurassic layers there associated with our site. How do I know it's a tree fern? I grow them in my backyard. No evidence of evolution at all. How big's our block? Well, I've walked over much of that section in Australia. It's roughly, it's huge. Now, there are other sections, but I haven't personally been digging in them. I've dug in many of the portions there, so I know about it. Those logs are over the whole lot, and they don't have roots and they don't have branches. That's a massive flood deposit. You can drive back to my house, you'll pass that plaque because I photographed it on the side of the road. You can ask to see my Silurian fossil. By the way, in geologic terms, that's right down near the bottom of the start of the fossils for all practical purposes. But you'll soon realise that if you call that one a living tassel fern, then I'll be honest with you, that is the oldest known tassel fern according to even the evolutionists in Australia. No evidence it has evolved in any significant way since what you call the Silurian times. So when I was at university, I was an evolutionist, but I started to come across thoughts like that. To the unprejudiced, not the people who just believe in God for the purposes of this debate, but to the unprejudiced, the fossil record of plants is in favour of special creation. Now there's only one bit of logic there. If you think things were created separately and then say do the fossil plants fit that, the answer is yes. It's not that you're being pushed by the paradigm, it's that that is the paradigm they actually fit. I mean, I'll help you a bit. There's our oldest fossil bacteria found in Australia. It's reported in Nature, 3.235 million years old the rock's supposed to be. How do we know it's some sort of bacteria? The reality is, we know it's a filamentous bacteria because they're still here. Now I'll be blunt, I used to believe in those billions of years, but if you haven't changed in 3.25 billion years, you're stuck in a rut. And I reached the conclusion, no, not at university, it was about 5 or 6 years after I'd finished university, that the fossils were no help to evolutionary theory. What about the lovely diagrams where they connect all the separate groups together? Well, it looks convincing until you ask, what is it they're not telling you about how they got that? You see, when you say 98% of people believe something in science, that bit of data is irrelevant. Absolutely nothing to do with percentages. Einstein had a time when he was the only person who could get his letters published in the Berlin press. He couldn't get them published anywhere else because 99.9% disagreed with it. How do you do it? First of all, you take the critters, you arrange them from simple to complex. Then you insert what you think are similar to this side or that side intermediates, like when we found the platypus in Australia. Where do we put it? And then you add non-living ones at the bottom. And you arrange them in order of increasing complexity. If you find any bits that don't work, you call them missing links. And then you go digging in Africa and you try and fit your new bones somewhere on your pre-existing concept of ascension. Archaeopteryx, you can put it right there. Then you claim this is proof of evolution, which has only got one problem. I'll tell you the problem I've discovered. In the real world, creatures at all levels of complexity, you think, what do you observe them to do? They only actually produce their own kind. And in the rocks, it's just as true, whether the creatures have made it to the present or not. You see, if you strip the theory off that diagram of fossil history, from the start, the fossil sharks, I can tell you what a fossil shark looks like. I've got hundreds of them on this computer. They just look like dead sharks. No wonder Dr. Thomas Kemp from Oxford University, probably a little more prestigious than where we are at the moment, but he wrote in virtually all cases a new group, a new taxon appears for the first time in the fossil record with most definitive features already present and practically no known stem group forms. I can vouch for that in terms of bacteria, stromatolites, whatever. In fact, I'd encourage you to have a look at one of your young university biology textbooks I didn't mean to have here but forgot all about. It says exactly the same thing. Okay, so whose paradigm is pushing who with the evidence? You've got to choose tonight. Things have not produced their own kind. Perhaps you've got to choose in 2 weeks. I wonder if my opponent will still believe in God in 2 weeks. Things have not produced their own kind, or they have. I wonder what you actually observe. There's my conclusion. I reached that about 10 years or so after I left university. There are plenty of opinions and theories that disagree with biblical creation, but the facts actually don't. You might want to ask, well, how would such genetic stability be maintained? I deliberately went and did 3 years of genetics because us geologists were undertakers. We dig up dead things. I wanted to find out how living things work. Let me show you some of the things I've learned. DNA, the code of life, tucked away inside the nucleus, doubly protected because it's so sensitive to breaking up, actually makes RNA to do its work for it. RNA You can take it or leave it. It passes out of the cell, doesn't matter if it gets destroyed. You make 3 types of it. Together they end up making proteins. Some of the proteins include DNA polymerase. The DNA polymerase sneaks back inside the nucleus. There it unzips the DNA, there it copies the DNA, and if there's any miscopies, it corrects it, snips it out, kicks the wrong chemical out, and orders it to get a new copy. Okay, notice what I've got on the bottom. This is a multi-step process. DNA can't make copies of itself unless it's got DNA polymerase. The DNA polymerase doesn't exist unless you've got DNA, and none of that will exist unless you've got double sets of protection, because all that radiation that's supposed to prove the world is so old actually ruins DNA. It'll ruin RNA as well. No part works unless all parts are present. Okay, at a more visible level in words, it's fascinating. I asked Dr. Diane Eager, who for many years was a lecturer in medical biology, now works full-time with creation research, could she just draw up some PowerPoints today, ship them to me in words on how the stability of the DNA is maintained. Here's what turned up this afternoon. New DNA strains are made by DNA polymerase. It's a large group of proteins. You saw that in my diagram. Each newly added base is checked for accuracy. Incorrect bases are removed and correct bases added. In other words, this DNA repair mechanism ensures genetic information remains unchanged. It goes even further. Chemical alteration or loss of individual bases, which covers mismatches, deletions, insertions. Some of you don't even know what they are, but you can look them all up. Single-stranded breaks, double-stranded breaks. There's over 60 mechanisms of dealing with these repairs. Not just making the stuff, but actually repairing the stuff so you maintain the same genetic code. There's all sorts of ways of fixing up bases that are being kicked out. You can even pick up the nucleotides that have been kicked out, whole sections that have been kicked out. You match it against the pre-existing chromosomes. And what even amazes me, you can break one of the strands. Now, I can understand how it could copy from the other strand because DNA works in 2 pairs. But sometimes you get both of the strands broken. And we know for a fact, I still remember my professor shaking his head over it, how does this DNA, which we have deliberately extracted stuff from, how does it put it back? Well, it has mechanisms of encoding new stuff to match what it is you took out. Now to me, that's brilliant. But if this system fails, and your cancers and your sicknesses have a lot to do with that, 2 things will happen. One is if the cell can't be repaired, it will be programmed to die. The DNA in that cell will not continue to transmit. You'll end up with diseases, cancers, aging processes. That's why you never see your biology professor who believes in evolution saying, go out and mutate students. They know the result. If you fail DNA repair mechanisms is why you're getting older. I used to have muscle down. I used to have more hair. But the interesting thing is, even with your death and degeneration, you are removing corrupted DNA from the system. Implication? DNA is designed to actually not evolve. The only process you see is actual replication constantly or degeneration. In other words, my challenge to you is this. Do you live in a world where even at the microscopic DNA level things do not produce their own kind? Or do you live in a world where at the microscopic level we can actually find mechanisms along which things actually do produce their kind, as Genesis 1 says 10 times that God made them to actually do. And by the way, in the end, it won't matter how many biologists accept or reject that. The only thing that will matter is it actually true? It's irrelevant how many biologists say they believe in God, because our friend hasn't answered one other question. Which God are you actually talking about? Because you see, I'm actually talking about the God of Genesis, who later in the New Testament is known as Jesus Christ. I wonder which God you believe or don't believe in. So my conclusion to finish off this section is there are plenty of opinions and theories that disagree with biblical creation, but I'm pushed to find a fact that actually does. It's easy to find 98% of biologists who might, but that's irrelevant.
Thank you, Mr. MacKay. Mr. Ryder, you have 10 minutes rebuttal.
I think time starts when I start talking.
Give me $40, I'll give you some more.
All right, you know what? I might need some extra time. There's this technique in creationist debate called the Gish Gallop, made famous by Dwayne Gish, where the creationist sort of goes through really quickly a whole ton of arguments, and then the scientist on the other end is like, my goodness, I have to go through at least several million of those pages to answer all of those, right? So Dr. Nealon assured me that Mr. MacKay wouldn't do this, but he did give me 11 arguments in 20 minutes. That's pretty impressive. You might remember a presentation by Jonathan Sarfati. Was that, what, a year ago, something like that? He gave us 35 arguments. That's a Gish Gallop, all right. Anyway, so I'll institute a new event here, which is going to be the scientist scramble. How many of the Gish Gallop arguments can you answer in 10 minutes?
The Ryder ramble.
Sorry? Oh, sorry. I agree. That was a bit of a ramble. Okay, yeah. The Ryder ramble. It's going to be the scientist ramble, but I'm a philosopher. That doesn't work anyways. I'm wasting time. Okay, so I wrote down his arguments. The first one was, you need to fit those puzzle pieces in, Dan. Absolutely, let's do that online later. The classification system shouldn't work on fossils, but it does. I was puzzled by this one. A favorite sort of creationist technique I found in raising arguments is to say some things that are true, but don't actually support their case. Classification system shouldn't work on the fossils, but it does. Well, it does because, well, the current organisms are descended from those older organisms, so they're going to be going to have similarities in common. So obviously, the classification system will prove to have some use. There are also cases where it's totally failed to work, like in the Burgess Shale. Anyway. He showed us some big smashed logs all scattered, turned into fossils. Looks like a flood. Well, you know what? Evolutionary biologists agree. Sometimes there were floods. Creationists, especially he listed some old dead guys. They came up with some ideas in evolutionary theory. Okay, yeah, that's true. Wallamies have turned into wallamies. So these are things that look like current organisms that can be found in the fossil record. So this shows that they're produced after their own kind. Similar sort of response that this isn't anything that an evolutionary biologist would deny. Obviously, there are going to be organisms in the fossil record that are similar to current organisms. There are also organisms in the fossil record that are not similar to current organisms. Another thing about fossils, I mean, in a way, they're not great evidence to do with, particular sequence of common descent, because you can't really tell much about an organism's metabolism and DNA, et cetera, by looking at the fossil. What it looks from the outside is not generally one of the leading features that biologists care about. Let's see, showed us some filamentous bacteria that haven't changed in 2.5 billion years. Okay, that's 10 arguments. That's the same argument. Okay. How many people believe evolution is irrelevant? 99% disagreed with Darwin at the time, after all. Yes, that wasn't my argument, though. My argument wasn't, look, there are all these people, all these biologists who agree with evolution, so you should too, right? My argument had to do with, okay, where does the evidence point? All the biologists think it points towards evolution. The young earth creationists think it points away from it. So somebody's making a mistake. Who's making a mistake? Who's being misled by dogmatic adherence to something? That's what my argument was. I was evidence for who's being misled by dogmatic adherence to another belief. It had nothing to do with the percentage of people who believe it. How evolutionists work, they make a chain of increasing complexity and fill in the blanks with imaginary creatures. They don't make chains, they make trees. That was what, that Dennis Venema argument that convinced him was all about trees, it's not about chains. And, it's easy to make a big bunch of similar creatures and kind of put them in this long chain, right? So relations of similarity, but it's very, very difficult to create trees of similarity. Trees of similarity are, take a bunch of, again, papers that my students hand in, right? They hand in a bunch of papers. There are going to be similarities among those papers. But if I can organize those similarities into a chain of inheritance, right? I'm going to say, look, you all got it from this person who copied, right? And then they copied again and copied. No, similarities don't organize in chains without common descent, right? Complex things, right? If they're similar in one aspect, right, they're not necessarily similar in another aspect. Okay. Probably we'll get into that a bit more later. He had his quote from Thomas Kemp from Oxford. Usually creatures appear in the fossil record without precursors. Common point, Thomas Kemp, of course, is a famous evolutionary biologist who did lots of work on mammalian evolution and doesn't have the slightest doubt that the thesis of common descent is true. Of course, the fossil record is highly spotty. It's rare for animals to be fossilized. So, and often creatures appear in the fossil record without precursors, and then later on, guess what? You find the precursors, or not necessarily precursors, often not, but related organisms. You find not your father, but your uncle. He pointed out this chicken and egg problem with DNA and DNA polymerase. I think this is more relevant to the abiogenesis debate, which is how life arose from non-life. I've already granted, for the sake of argument, that God created life. This question that we were debating today was about common descent. If we want to have a different debate, I'm happy to engage in that. All right, I'm almost there. How much time do I have?
3 minutes.
3 minutes, awesome. Okay. Last. He talks about the 60 mechanisms for dealing with DNA repairs, right? This requires many complex proteins. With failure, you get degeneration. So there's all this work. There's a few different points he could have been making. The main one seemed to be there's all this work that the cell goes to stop DNA from mutating, right? The mutation is bad. That's true. Too much mutation is bad, right? But there are also mechanisms that biologists have studied which actually encourage evolvability, which encourage certain kinds of mutation to improve, for example, a bacterium's ability to adapt to an antibiotic. There are mechanisms designed to stop mutation. There are mechanisms designed to encourage certain kinds of mutations. These mechanisms to prevent too much. But we know that a lot of it isn't prevented. I mean, each one of you probably has about 100 mutations each. Most of them don't do much. Some of them might be harmful, some of them might be beneficial. That's what evolution works on. That's the material. Okay. All right. Well, that gives me a chance to do that last bit I didn't get to from before, which is, so remember we were sitting there with Mr. MacKay and his puzzle piece, and he was trying to fit that little truth of the Bible in there. And I suggested he was about to wield the X-Acto knife. He didn't do too much of that. But let me talk about another place where you need to wield the X-Acto knife on a literal interpretation of the Bible, where biblical inerrancy should make you get this knife out too. But this is an area where Mr. MacKay doesn't. He believes that homosexuality is an abomination and gays and lesbians deserve to die. He says on his website, in an audio clip, that AIDS is God's weapon for striking them down. This is coming from a literalist or an inerrantist view of the Bible. He even suggests here, this is from his website, that Heath Ledger was marked down for death for impersonating a gay man in Brokeback Mountain. All right, all I'm asking is for you to reject the view that Genesis is a science text written in literal language by an infallible author and then infallibly copied over thousands of years. That's not asking much. I think there's some of this moral stuff that ought to be rejected too. There's a lot of great stuff in the Bible too, mostly in the New Testament. Okay? Importance of love and compassion. I'm all with that. But not this other stuff. Reject this literalism, this inerrancy. Thank you.
You have 10 minutes to rebut Mr. Ryder's main case.
Thank you. I will be fascinated to see those comments on homosexuality, even though the God of the Bible is absolutely opposed to homosexuality. I, for the life of me, can't remember saying what I've been quoted as saying, but I will check it. Gish Gallop, I really only said 2 points, and that is that you have plenty of evidence that things have produced their own kind, whether it's fossil or whether it's actually in the living creatures. And I do think we do need to understand again the importance of majorities in science. See my grey hair? I'm old enough to have started university in the geology department when if you wanted your PhD you had to believe in geosynclinal theory. And then by the time I finished my university, if you didn't believe in continental drift, you didn't get your PhD. It was a good experience because none of the evidence had changed whatsoever. What changed was the professor who was heading up the department and the philosophy that he was using to push the facts into. Of course, Einstein, he replaced all those who would oppose him, became the king of the pile, and if you've been following experiments in the Hadron Collider, the 16,000 times they now seem to have got a particle to move faster than the speed of light, he may be bumped off the throne very shortly, regardless of how much percentage of following he actually has. So I can't stress enough, percentage in science has nothing to do with what the truth actually is at all. I did enjoy listening to my friend. He still hasn't told us who God is or which God he believes, but he did make a concession and say for the purpose of the debate he believes in God. I hope later he tells us which God it is. And secondly, the word evolution does not exclude abiotic origins. How do I know that? You run a biology department in this university, go and get the textbook, open it up to the section on evolution, and the first chapters will be on the amino acid experiments, Miller's experiments to try and show how chemicals actually evolve into living proteins that evolved into, well, the next bit's a bit fuzzy. Doesn't matter whether you're trying to make RNA or DNA or whatever. I'm sorry, evolution is all about non-living molecules, hydrogen, turning into professors who speak against creation. When you have a look at the arguments from language, I do hope you realise some interesting aspects of that argument that weren't quite fully pointed out. It was well done, and we certainly do use similarities. I travel a lot and I enjoy picking up bits and pieces of language. The Finnish and Hungarian, I haven't got a clue how their language really functions. I have interacted with them, and when they translate, they tell me, give us a verb in all of your phrases, because you English don't use enough verbs. And until you've got the verb, we don't know what you're talking about. So I have to make sure to do that, which we don't do in English. Similarities, they don't have as many similarities as the French do with our English language. But in reality, every one of those lovely phrases and statements that were up there, do you realise none of them happened without intelligent design? He created that data point. He existed before and he's not a part of it, and he's smarter than it. But he should have pointed out that it actually doesn't tell you where language comes from. It just tells you, like the point he's trying to make, what we've done to it since it's got here using our creative intelligence. We invent words all the time. We create new words. We even create new bits of grammar. Dr. Ed Nealon has been on my back, put the apostrophes in. And so I asked him, haven't you read the book on the history of the apostrophe? We invented the stuff. We can use it wherever we like. But he wouldn't accept that argument. What the interesting thing about languages I have observed is that you actually visit most of the cultures, and I've visited many of them, despite their language. A, they often have a story about a big global flood. B, their traditional ancestral forms of belief are all about creation. As one philosopher pointed out, we have a bit of a dilemma. How can we teach people evolution when they traditionally all believe in creation? Our government faced a real dilemma there when they tried to impose evolution on the Aborigines, and the Aborigines said, we don't believe that stuff. They're traditionally all creationists. Interesting dilemma. They believe language was created in the beginning, and now we creatively actually use it. All right, percentages, I've coped with that. Finnish, Polish, you name it. He did make an accurate comment that they both cannot be correct. I have to agree with him on that, as Charles Darwin did. Because Charles Darwin trained as an Anglican clergyman and became the biologist, geologist, come evolutionist later on. But his final conclusions sort of tended towards saying, I have finally come to realise the Bible with its manifestly false history of the world. So full marks, he's quite right, it cannot be both evolution and creation together. I say that because for many years my professor said, John, just say God used evolution. I tried, but I had to answer the question, which God am I talking about? Because the God in the biblical account of creation does not allow you that liberty at all. And I would stress that the point that I made over and over again is, and it was conceded by my friend here, I did appreciate that the fossils are no help to the theory of evolution. But that does raise an interesting philosophical problem. And that is that if you only use the present life forms and your belief in what is similar or dissimilar to argue which is related, you then need to honestly say, now how do I test my theory? Because otherwise you have to say, all I've ever seen is creatures produce their own kind. Oh yes, you argue that mutations can produce, well you didn't use the word but you meant beneficial, when they adapt to become resistant to antibiotics. I have to tell you this, I was there when Professor Mather announced to the genetics department, he'd just come back from a conference, we have discovered that bacteria are not evolving by mutation resistance to antibiotics. We thought they were, you exposed them to penicillin, they turned out to be resistant, you had to change the antibactericide. And then when we tried 2, a second one, they evolved resistant to that. And then we tried 3, and then we tried 4, and all of a sudden there were bacteria resistant to 4 at once. And he said, that's too quick. Mutations, 1 in every 15,000 duplications, becoming resistant in 2 generations is not mutation. You know what we discovered? We were simply eliminating the ones that didn't already have resistance. And then what they were doing was having their annual bacterial convention and swapping the bits of resistance. We didn't think bacteria were intersex, but that's bacterial sex, and they swap all the best bits, and that's why we can't win the battle. So as your doctor tells you, don't abuse bactericides, don't abuse your antibiotics. They'll last a lot longer if you don't. Why? Because bacteria actually aren't evolving. The more you use them, the more you're killing off the ones that aren't actually already resistant. I'll stop there. We're going to move on now to questions, I believe.
So now each participant can ask the other one question, and the answer can be up to 5 minutes long. So we'll start with Mr. Ryder. One question for Mr. MacKay.
All right. This is my question. Mr. MacKay, what piece of evidence, if any, This could be, imagine some future thing that you run into. Or a whole bunch. It might have to be a whole bunch, right? But give me a description if there's anything that would convince you that something in Genesis is false.
The question was first really answered by Charles Darwin, because there was a time in his life when he was trained to be an Anglican clergyman, and he firmly accepted Christianity as a paradigm. I doubt if he was ever a Christian. Being a clergyman was a good income, and that's all his father was interested in Darwin becoming a clergyman. But you see, he answered a very important question, because part of our modern concept of science is not just trying to prove something in favour, but being able to establish an event when you can falsify a position you held or falsify somebody else's position. So if it is true that God created creatures after their kinds, and that's where Darwin started. Of course, Darwin did have a little disadvantage. He started out in Victorian England, where the English had this belief: God is English. The English rule the world. The English are the way God wants them to be. God has made everything exactly as it is now. And hence you find Darwin writing a book on the origin of species, not on the origin of kinds. Because by Victorian times, species had become the thing that God had specially created. Even Linnaeus, who invented the classification system, used the word genus, not species. So hence Darwin says, if I can show that finches on the Galapagos Islands have come from South America and evolved into 8 different species of finches, therefore ultimately finches weren't created. That's his logic. So Darwin was the first to think of a way of falsifying Genesis. So to answer your question, it's very simple, sir. If you can establish that creature A, which is identifiably both at a morphological level, how you see it's a bit you dig up out of the rocks, and genetically in the present, if you can establish that one kind of creature has actually turned into a totally unrelated, different kind of creature, then you can demolish Genesis as easy as one thing, and that's what Darwin thought he'd achieved. Of course, he should have gone a bit further. He should have told us ultimately how his friend Huxley's theory said dinosaurs turned into finches. That would have been really worth looking at.
Mr. MacKay, you can now ask a question to Mr. Ryder.
Thank you, sir. Okay, there's my question. Can you provide any example of evidence for evolution that does not presuppose evolution has already happened? Because if you can't, we must all conclude that this is a world where all creatures are observed to only reproduce their own kind, as biblical creation or Genesis states they were created to do.
Yeah, so I thought that the evidence that I presented to do with similarities structured into trees was doing the job, because that doesn't assume that evolution is true, right? In fact, you could actually, as a creationist, believe that God designed all the creatures by using this copying mechanism. So you could, right? So you could kind of combine this creationist view with common descent, right? So you could, and I don't know, maybe you now accept common descent, but and then we have to have so once you've accepted the common descent part, right, which is a consequence of evolutionary theory, but doesn't assume it. So you start with those similarities structured into trees. Assume common descent. Well, then you infer common descent. So then you have to discuss what the mechanism is for that common descent. There's lots of controversy within evolutionary theory. How important is our random processes like genetic drift? How important is mutation? How important is in bacteria gene exchange? How important are factors that are outside the genome? You inherit lots of cytoplasm from your mother's egg cells. How much of an effect does that have? So there's lots of controversies within evolutionary theory about exactly what the mechanism is. Lynn Margulis thought that Symbiotic processes were very important. And she did ultimately show that mitochondria and chloroplasts were actually bacteria that had been incorporated into other bacteria to form eukaryotic cells. So, in answer to the summary of the answer to the question is the arguments for common descent, which we'll go into online, establish common descent without assuming evolution. And then there's a discussion about what the mechanism is. Was it God creating the copies, or was it a natural process? I'll stop there. That's good.
So that concludes the formal part of the debate between these two gentlemen, but now we get the fun part. This is your chance to ask questions to either gentleman. They will have time to respond, 2 minutes to respond, and then if one wishes to rebut the response, they can do that. What we're going to do is we're going to try, I'll bring the microphone to you. So we'll just start. First person with their hands up gets to ask a question, and I'll just come around. Go ahead.
All right, you mentioned a bunch of mechanisms that preserve the structure of DNA. And Dan Ryder mentioned that there were mechanisms that mess up the structure, that transpose specific elements from one chromosome to another, and that those are naturally occurring and random. They're called transposomes. And the enzymes that do that are called transposases. Would you please be able to comment on their role in a intelligent design creationist worldview? Thank you.
Well, I think you've just pointed out exactly the point I was making. They pre-exist, those mechanisms. The mechanisms are actually already there, and we have discovered them. And they do function in accordance with physical principles, and the end result, if it is negative to the organism, it is eliminated by ill health, by failure, by anything else. It's simply moved out of the system if it doesn't work. Right, so what you find is the whole concept of transposons, an exciting new discovery, actually doesn't enable anything to evolve in a Darwinian or even a punctuated equilibrium sense at all.
So I don't think Mr. MacKay actually answered the question. I will go into the online debate, the role of transposons, and they're very important for detecting these similarities that are structured into trees that I mentioned. Of course, when something goes wrong and the organism doesn't survive, that is the operation of selection, right? You get variation, and you get the selection of the organisms that survive, and those are the ones that pass on offspring, and that's precisely how evolution works. I don't know, Chris, you had said about maybe holding the applause until the end of the session. Are we going to do applause after every question and answer? It's a little bit distracting.
Who's your question directed to? Go ahead.
Mr. MacKay, thank you for this evening. This is my very first creationist evolutionary debate, and my question may be quite naive, as I'm not sure I've understood it correctly, so please take that into consideration very quickly. My question regards Genesis. God created all kinds, and those kinds are good. With that, I'm sure you agree. Then you went on to describe DNA. I'm not a scientist. You said, though, that DNA corrects and maintains itself. It's circular in that respect. Now, on the issue of homosexuality, you have been quoted as calling it an abomination. If God created all kinds, and that is the very beginning of the Bible, whatever comes later really might be inconsequential compared to that, how could homosexuals be anything other than perfectly correct? Because if you try to take the homosexuality out, DNA, like you specified, correct and maintained. And this is only one kind and good.
Okay, interesting question. But if you are trying to put a homosexual Adam in the Garden of Eden, you wouldn't be here asking the question. Natural selection eliminates homosexuality. It's a sexual question. It is not a help to evolution. It's exactly the opposite. Thirdly, you will find that the whole conflict behind the scenes about this debate is, given that we say it's Newton's principle, it's Archimedes' principle, it's Morse code, if it's God's world, he has the right to make the rules. And what you find in his creation, he makes a man and a woman, and then Jesus Christ, who the New Testament says is the God of Genesis, actually says, haven't you read, back in the beginning, God made them male and female, therefore a man will take a woman. End of argument. You and I may think we can argue against it. If you want to get God to change his mind, you go right ahead. I don't offer you much chance of success. But that's the basic moral position. Here's what God did. Here's what he says about it. From there on, he treats homosexuality as an abomination, not me. I had one young lady come to me and said, what right have you got to condemn me as a lesbian? I said, absolutely none. I'm a sinner like you are, and you need Jesus just like I did. Right, so that's my position, no matter what you've heard from my opponent.
Mr. Ryder, do you care to respond?
Yeah, I'll respond. I can't imagine that a good God could possibly condemn someone for their sexual preference. There is some interesting literature on the evolution of homosexuality, which I don't know very much about, but I will check into it for the online discussion. Earlier, Mr. MacKay asked for the quote where he was talking about homosexuality and AIDS. I do have that. Here's the quote. And if you want to know what's wrong with homosexuality and why Paul wrote in Romans that when men leave God out of their knowledge, God turns them over to foolishness. Men with men, women with women, reaping the reward in their own flesh they justly deserve. That's called AIDS. Yes, that's terribly discriminating, isn't it? That could get me into trouble. Just did. But you see, it got Jerry Falwell into trouble too, didn't it? Yes, it did, and I'm with him. I'm on his side.
Okay, we have a question here. Who's your question for? Okay, for Mr. MacKay.
I'm wondering if you're familiar with a book called Sex at Dawn.
No, I am not familiar with a book called Sex at Dawn. I don't even know who Dawn is.
It's a sexual anthropological study on the history of sexuality in human beings. And it starts off with the theory that human beings are not monogamous, and that the function of homosexual sex in human society is to bring society closer together and to emotionally bond people of the same gender as well as people of different genders together so that society works as a cohesive whole. What would you say to that sort of theory?
Okay, do you know who the author is?
I can't remember it off the top of my head now.
Okay, well my comment would be if that author was God, I'd be interested in that opinion. But since that author is not God, and on Judgment Day I will not have to give account of that person, then their opinion has no more weight than my opinion. In other words, the point I'm making is simple. The whole relevance of this issue is that given that God actually owns the universe, then your and my opinions and convictions have to be tailored to what he says is right. Because you and I have so little experience, well, I'm sorry, we may reach the wrong conclusion 9 times out of 10, unless he's told us what the right conclusion is already. That's as far as I want to go. I disagree with the statement, but my reason is because of what the God who created has actually said. Same as the statement he just read is not the quote he made in his lecture. I used what God said about homosexuality, and don't worry about me, Keith Ledger. You'll already have to stand before God.
Thanks, Keith. Mr. Ryder, do you care to respond?
Yeah, I'll have a quick comment. So I thought that was a nice illustration of Mr. MacKay holding on to that puzzle piece no matter what, right? Another comment, homosexuality is very common in bonobo societies, relative to chimpanzees, and it does seem to serve this very function. No doubt that book engages in discussion of private societies like that. Yeah. Thank you.
Who's your question for?
Mr. MacKay.
So, Mr. MacKay.
If Jesus didn't accept the dogma of his day, then why should you?
Well, the dogma of my day is evolution. Our friend has already said 98% of biologists believe it, so I'm obviously not accepting the dogma of my day. You see, it's a dogma because none of the evolutionists I know who believes in it is actually doing it. They just believe it. They don't see it, so therefore it's a dogma that you have to actually accept. If you mean accept the Christian doctrine, well, if it's already been rejected, it can't be majority dogma, I'm afraid, but I do accept it.
Mr. Ryder, for response.
Brief comment. Mr. MacKay has said a few times, right, if you don't see it, then it's just dogma. And that's just completely false. That's very bad philosophy of science. There are examples where we don't see things, yet we infer that they exist. So we don't see atoms, yet we infer they exist. We don't see that, we don't even really see that the Earth goes around the sun, right? But we infer that that is true. We certainly don't see into the past. However, if you look at tree rings in Germany, and you look at the living trees and then past trees, and each tree ring gets put down, right, with, it's a certain width and characteristic depending on the season, and you can match tree to tree. The same year. This is a tree ring that comes from the same year. And you can follow those tree rings back and back and back using dead trees, from living trees all the way back. And no, this is not using fossils, okay? All the way back 11,000 years, actually over 11,000 years, using these oaks from Germany, with, like 100 trees replicating each step back. Now, we don't see that 11,000 years ago, but it would be crazy to think it didn't happen, okay? Now, Mr. MacKay thinks the Earth is less than 10,000 years old, but we've got tree rings going back to 11,000 years, okay? Anyway.
Who's your question for?
Mr. MacKay.
Okay, go ahead.
If all civilizations date back to originally Adam and Eve and oral traditions, traditions of how they got kicked out of the Garden of Eden were orally passed down from generation to generation, how did tens, if not hundreds, of other religions come?
How did tens, if not hundreds of other what? Religions. Oh, religions.
And other creation stories.
Okay, you will find the whole of history is very interesting, like the Aborigines in Australia distinctly have a creationist mythology, as we call it, but it's definitely been verbal. But since the Aborigines in the Northern Territory use an Indian word for their boomerang, and since they have dogs that are found in India, we know they came from India, where they could write, where they had written texts, which also include creation accounts and Noah's flood type accounts. So it's provable beyond a shadow that many cultures have lost information or lost technology. You can follow the Maori culture from Asia out through the islands. They had pots, they lost pots on Coral Islands, never refound them again. So much of history is the opposite of evolutionary ascension. It's the loss of information. The biblical picture, as I said, creation, perfect, very good. You didn't need technology because the air conditioning in the Garden of Eden was automatic. You didn't have to waste your money on weed killers, there were no weed. Then man sins, you lose the plot, things go from good to bad to worse. Then you get the Tower of Babel where that common group is split up. All of a sudden the people who painted the tower, now they haven't been growing wheat for 50 years. Now they're out there and all of a sudden they're a primitive culture. We know this happens because we watched it happen to the hippies in the inland of Australia where you can live all year just off fruit and berries. They had children out there in the forest who didn't even know their grandparents went to the moon. So loss of information is a fact of history that's fairly easy to establish. So I suspect that number one, when you read in Genesis chapter 5, where it says this is the written record of Adam. that that's exactly what it was. And then as you get finally down to the Aboriginals, who are so anti-evolution because of their culture, they actually had lost writing and passed it on down. Totally unpopular view of history these days, because we like to see it this way. But yet there's so much of history which has actually been in that direction. I guess that's probably enough to comment on that one.
Mr. Ryder, could I respond?
Just briefly, speaking to the conservative Christians in the audience, I'm just wondering if you think that there's absolutely no chance that some aspect of Genesis, right, was basically a creation myth, right? Maybe it was inherited from the Egyptians. I don't know, just, is there nothing that could convince you that that is just even the slightest possibility? Because that's where Mr. MacKay is starting from. There's no possibility for that. Just quoting from a debate that he had with John Polkinghorne, he says, the whole point that I've been trying to make tonight is that Scripture must be there, and the science must bow its knee to that, because God was there and the scientist wasn't. Right? Well, that clearly presupposes that God was the one writing Genesis, right? Or that God told somebody what to put in Genesis. And it also presupposes that through the hundreds and hundreds of years that Genesis was copied to copy, that no possibility for mistake was there. I mean, can't you acknowledge that that's at least a possibility, right? And then we have to decide, well, okay, did it happen? Let's look at the evidence.
Okay, next question. Who's your question for?
So the question for Mr. MacKay. I'm a little confused by both your biblical scholarship and your science, so excuse me, but are you advocating in this whole thing around the DNA correcting itself, that maybe humans should help DNA along by returning to the eugenics that was pushed forward by the church in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, which actually led to the sterilization of what were supposedly mentally ill women?
Well, I'd actually suspect you need to revise your history, since Darwin's cousin, our friend Dalton, was the founder of eugenics, and Hitler was his biggest supporter. Hitler and the churches don't go hand in hand. I'd encourage you to read the letters Hitler wrote to the churches on how he tricked control out of the Lutheran church. It's a brilliant set of politics, but it's on getting rid of the church. So I doubt very much if you find you could support the thesis that there was the church that enforced eugenics at all. I just have no other comments except revise your history on where our eugenics came from. Dalton, very anti-church, anti-Christian. Hitler, its biggest opponent, very anti-church, very anti-Christian. You may find it being used in some of the systems over here, where in the USA and Canada you had well-meaning citizens who said, here is a degenerate level, if you're below that, we will not allow you to actually reproduce and multiply, because you'll reproduce and multiply down the hill. So there's no doubt about that's a fact of history in some of your adoption clinics that I can find. But I find it very hard to attribute that to the Christian church in the 1800s pushing eugenics at all.
Mr. Ryder, you could respond.
I highly recommend reading Dave Barry's article on how to argue. He gives a lot of really bad advice about how to argue. It's really how to, engage in rhetoric. And the very last one is, when you need the big guns, bring out Hitler. I really object to, any kind of even slight intimation of a comparison with Hitler, because I believe in evolution like he did. Anyway, whether or not the church at one point in history contributed to a eugenics program or encouraged a eugenics program is completely irrelevant. If Dalton also was in favor of it and Hitler was in favor of it, and it's even doubly irrelevant that those two people are somehow connected with evolution.
Okay, next question. To whom?
This is to Dr. Ryder. Yes, I believe the tenets of evolution state that through evolution, mutations evolved into other species. That's the basic tenet. And yet from observation, we can see that in our world today, mutations are sterile and don't evolve into other species. Can you give us some real facts to justify this theory, not just obscure statements?
Well, I'll certainly go into this kind of stuff online in detail, but I can definitely show you. Here's a mutation, okay? See this guy? Oh, actually, we need to turn off that. Just one example. It's completely false that mutations are never beneficial. Look, we saw actually in the Bergman talk, the last Creation Club event that I was at, that mutations are very common, that they're usually neutral, which is something that Bergman agreed with. They can be negative or positive, and whether they're negative or positive depends very, very much on their environment. So, you know, we've shown that one very small mutation in the brown bear makes the polar bear. And, you know, when you're living in the forest, having bright white fur is not so good. So Mr. MacKay would say, oh, guess what? That's a great example of degeneration, right? But as soon as the polar bear goes to the Arctic, well, guess what? Now that's beneficial. There's no, you know, whether it's degenerative or beneficial makes absolutely no sense without considering the environment. Anyway, so here's an example of a mutation. This guy has polydactyly, okay? We know exactly how this mutation works. We know exactly the proteins involved. We know exactly how this directs development, and you get extra fingers. Well, this guy is really good at climbing trees. He makes money climbing trees. Actually, he probably makes more money from being polydactylous. But he shows off his tree climbing ability to go get coconuts. Not just one tiny example.
Mr. MacKay, you can respond.
Yes, well, I think my response has to be it's a wonderful, interesting example of someone with busted genomes controlling a number of fingers, because the evolutionist argument is all about how we've got common pentadactyly and he hasn't, and usually the surgeons will chop them off when they're first born because they do tend to get in the road. Notice one other thing, he still looks like you and me except for these extra digits that turn out in the end they won't prove to be helpful to the human race. He's not anything classifiable except as Homo sapiens sapien, and that's what the debate's about. Origin of the species. He doesn't come anywhere near being helpful to the theory of evolution or Darwin's thesis at all.
Climate changes over billions of years.
Who's your question for? So this is for Dr. MacKay. Go ahead.
Dr. MacKay, I apologize if my question is at all off topic, but I was just wondering, is there any archaeological evidence other than oral tradition to support the world being flooded at one time?
Okay, I'm going to change PowerPoint things here, so just give me 30 seconds to find the download. There's a quote that you'll find very interesting. However, some recent studies suggest the water may have covered Earth's entire surface for some 200 million years before the continents emerged. Now, if you skip the 200 million years bit, it's certainly a lot of water, and it's certainly a concession that there is plenty of evidence that the whole surface of the world was covered by water. It helps those people who say, how could you get enough water to cover the Earth? Well, I came up to that conclusion many years ago. I was asked to give a lecture at the Oxford Geological Association, and a paper was published by two of our academics in Canberra, and their thesis was no water, no granite, no continents. So all the basement rocks of the entire planet show evidence that Earth has had water on it right from the start. This guy goes one step further, and so would I, because the surface of that granitic basement area, come with me on the field trips, it is scoured off by massive water action right across planet Earth. So you can start there, and you can even go further. You see, at certain times in Earth's history, says Professor Derek Ager, who is an evolutionist, or was, he's dead now, but he said at certain times particular types of sedimentary environments were prevalent over vast areas of the Earth's surface. So I gave you an example of one. And you see, I took the group over that, well, pretty much of that section. But what most people miss, and most geologists miss, that's sandstone. And sandstone is usually derived from things like granite, and you eliminate 2/3 of the rest of it to make this stuff here. So if you've got 1/3 of Australia covered with solid sandstone full of huge logs, you've demolished a block of ground about the size of Australia in order to produce that. So the water is not just on that yellow bit. The water is over a much vaster area indeed. And what else is interesting is if you come to our site and have a look at some of the fossils, the fossil pine leaves, the fossil one of my pines, I just split that 2 weeks ago. There's a nice herring alongside it. Now herring of course live in the water, and it's not the only one we've got in our collection. I mean, there's that one there. And you think Australian animals are unique? Well, I'm sorry, you can go to the Green River shales and dig up exactly the same sort of fishes. Fabulous. Land creatures mixed with sea creatures. Interesting evidence that water has been on the land and ended up dumped in another place. One last illustration. Remember the tree ferns I showed you? Most of you missed the comment, so I'll repeat it. When you dig up the rocks, like this block of limestone derived from shells of mollusks like water snails and that, it's full of tree ferns. Land deposits mixed with sea creatures. So if you're looking for further evidence of inundations on the planet, I'd encourage you, when you look at the fossil record, to note the odd thing about it. The fossils are actually often in the wrong places, in the wrong orders. I'd encourage you to ask why there are so many sea creatures buried with land creatures, or if you go to the amber fields of Poland, why is there coral mixed in with the deposits of pine amber? Interesting question. Thank you.
So at one time the Earth was mostly covered in water, and it still is. It's interesting. There is evidence for floods in, for example, the Black Sea area. There's a possibility that there was a massive flood. The Persian Gulf has gradually moved up inland, taking up covering some territory that was not previously covered. There's speculation that these kinds of events are actually the foundation for the original flood story. The flood story appears in our oldest literature in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it matches perfectly the Noah story, even to the point of, well, not God, but Ishtar, I think Ishtar, putting the rainbow in the sky to mark a covenant saying, look, I promise I won't do it again. That and many other details are in the Gilgamesh story. Anyway, the flood in Genesis is a very rich subject. About there's questions about how all those animals and all their food, and never mind all their poop, are going to make it on the ark. Interesting subject. I think again this is a question of trying to make that puzzle piece fit. I shouldn't say anything more about that.
Okay, thank you. Next question to whom would you like to direct? Mr. MacKay?
Sorry, sort of tying in as well. Mr. Ryder earlier this evening brought up a study of sorts that I've also looked into myself that says that chimpanzee DNA and our DNA match up 98% of the time. How could that just be a coincidence?
Well, the interesting thing is you phrased it in such a way that in a democracy it sounds appealing, because we think percentages actually mean something. 98% similar? Question. How important is the 2% difference? Because obviously it's important enough that it means no chimpanzee is here tonight attending this debate. In fact, they're not even asking that question. They haven't even had a debate on the issue based on all the evidence at all. So the 2% may in the end turn out to be more important than the 98% similar. But having gone thoroughly into genetic codes, I have to point out one other thing. When it comes to codes, percentages are irrelevant. Let me give you some of our friend's language codes that he put up there before. Let's give you an English code. It would reflect his position probably yesterday. God is nowhere. It's English code, you read it from left to right, you know what it means. Let me take exactly the same symbols in exactly the same order.